Give everybody another, we'll just give everybody another minute to jump on. Dawn, I'm happy to see you. You were part of the impetus for this happening today.
I was.
Yeah, nice to see everybody.
Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Fieldstone4U. We're the Robins. I'm Robin Sinclair, Executive Director. Robin Stropko, who is everything else. She does everything. So we're happy that you're here. Most of you we know, and if we haven't met you before, welcome to one of our programs. So the history of Fieldstone4U, it was born out of COVID during the pandemic. And our tagline was, you ask, we listen. And then I would try to find a speaker to provide subject expert content for all of you. And there were so many issues that came up in our lives. And, you know, we at Fieldstone just want to be that resource for you. And so that was the history. So we had webinars as needed. And then thankfully, we no longer need to have these kinds of webinars. But when something like this pops up, it was the perfect venue for what we'll be hearing today. So that's the history of Fieldstone4U. Programming is in session. We have a summer cohort going on right now, which is just wonderful. We start month 3, and then all of our other programming starts again in January. We'll have a cohort for the CEOs, cohort for senior leaders, and our executive coaching program starts again in January. So if you have interest or if you have staff that's interested, please feel free to reach out to Robin Stropko and she can get you an application. As I always say, don't worry about payment until later, because we want to make sure that you get an application in and we can at least timestamp it so we know that you are in, and we'll save you a spot. General housekeeping, just keep yourself muted. We appreciate that. Thank you for making your organizations, if you can, on your name so that Tiffany, our speaker, can see what organization she's sharing her knowledge with. So if you have a second, you can change your title. That would be awesome. Put your questions in the chat. Tiffany will be sharing a PowerPoint presentation that Robin will be able to send to all of you after today's presentation. And this is recorded as well. So Robin will also send you the link. It is on our YouTube channel. And thankfully, Tiffany is so generous in letting us record this. So she'll send that to you. But if you have particular questions, put it in the chat. I will try to monitor that. Tiffany will as she can. And then if there is time at the end, then we'll do a Q&A. Always feel free to share with either Robin or myself if there are other topics of interest for you, something that you really need to know. We have our Crossroads and Turning Points, which is our speaker series, our in-person sessions that we charge. This is something that we offer to you free of charge. Again, grateful for Tiffany and her service to the community in offering to do this for us. So this came out of one of our lunch and learns, and we just started chatting about, you know, what do we need? And this, and actually one of our coaching sessions. And so 2 of our coaches started talking about this PAGA lawsuit that I had never heard of, and heard 2 horror stories right off the bat. And Dawn, who's on the call, Dawn, raise your hand so Tiffany can see who you are. Dawn, and I can't tell if Renetta is on this as well. It might be on a different screen that I need to scroll over, but 2 of them were talking about how it was impacting their organization. And they said, we really need to know more about it. And I said, I happen to know somebody. So Tiffany is my next door neighbor and my friend and an expert in this field, and so generously gave up her time at the beginning of the pandemic when we were all faced with, you know, some employment issues at the start. Nobody knew what to do. And Tiffany came on. And so when I asked her again, she said, absolutely. So Tiffany, thank you for saying yes. And we're super excited to hear from you. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Tiffany, who's an employment law partner with Snell and Wilmer, going to navigate California's complex wage and hour laws, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Robin, for the kind introduction. Nice to meet you all via Zoom, at least. As Robin said, I am a partner at Snell and Wilmer. My practice focuses exclusively on employer side employment law. I like to say that I represent the good guys. So I help clients in all different industries of all different sizes deal with their employment issues, both on the front end, doing things just like this, trainings, policy drafting, things like that, to try to prevent lawsuits. And then inevitably people get sued. I defend my clients in any type of lawsuit brought by an employee. It can be a single plaintiff claims claiming I was discriminated against or harassed. And more, and what we're going to be talking about today, my practice has included these class action or PAGA, and we'll talk about what that means, claims for wage and hour violations. We're going to be talking about really kind of ticky-tacky stuff. And because it can be brought on a class-wide basis, plaintiffs' lawyers love it, and it's becoming a larger and larger part of my practice. So I'm happy to share my experience with you, give you some tips. Hopefully you will leave this morning armed with some information to help protect your organization and do your best to not have to deal with one of these claims. But I will tell you at the outset, for those of you who are already dealing with it, it happens to the best of us. Nobody is immune from these. Unfortunately, even if you try to do everything right, again, these laws are so ticky-tacky, the plaintiff's lawyers can probably find something. And most of them don't care that you're a nonprofit and you're doing wonderful things in our community, and they're just going to be hurting your bottom line by bringing it. Doesn't matter to them, unfortunately. I've defended nonprofits in these cases as well. So on that bright note, yes, I'm going to do my best to share my screen and the PowerPoint. So hopefully I do this correctly. Come on here, share from beginning. Start this slideshow. Okay, no, this is still showing the background, isn't it? Okay. Is that better? Is that just the
There you go. Perfect.
slide? Okay, perfect. All right. I kind of touched on this a little bit. Plaintiffs, lawyers love wage and hour claims. They love these claims because they can often be proved using only documents. Think about, what's at issue. We're talking about time cards, pay stubs, things like that, where they can look at the records and make some sort of an evaluation as to whether or not there's a violation, versus something like a messy sex harassment claim where you've got to interview witnesses. There's credibility issues to decide. He said, she said. There's lots of facts and things that you might have to gather to prove that kind of case. But in these cases, they're pretty simple. It's just often about documents themselves. They
Tiffany,
lead.
hold on one
Yep.
sec. Tiffany,
No problem.
can all of you please mute your screens, mute your voice? I think we have some background noise. So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem. They often lead to derivative claims. So what I'm talking about there is it's not just the underlying violation, but these add-on claims that we'll get into later. And a lot of these claims carry with them automatic penalties. So again, in contrast to like a discrimination claim or harassment claim where you're having to prove up, how much were you actually damaged? How much emotional distress did you actually suffer? Here, it's just an automatic dollar amount that's attached onto every claim. So it's easy. And this next one is the kicker. They carry with them an award of attorney's fees. So if a plaintiff's lawyer brings a class action or any of these wage and hour type of claims, even on an individual basis, and they prove even a minimal violation, if you only owe just, a few hours of overtime pay, they get all of their attorney's fees automatically added to that. So it's really not a whole lot of risk for them. The flip side of that, unfortunately, is employers don't, when we win, you still have to pay my fees. The plaintiffs and the plaintiffs' lawyers don't have to reimburse you for our fees. It's a one-way system, and it's totally stacked against you as the employer. And then finally, they're ripe for class treatment. Again, if you contrast it to a harassment case where you're talking about how is one individual treated, it's not how an entire department of people is treated or how all of your employees are treated. It's, harassment is a one-on-one thing. A wrongful termination claim is a one-on-one thing. These type of wage and hour claims can be dealt with on a class-wide basis. For example, all of the pay stubs are set up incorrectly, or your timekeeping is set up incorrectly and it affects all of your employees. So because they can affect a large group of employees, that's one more reason why the plaintiffs' lawyers love these cases. So who are we talking about when we talk about these cases, and who are the plaintiffs that bring them? What we're talking about are your hourly non-exempt employees. We are especially talking about your hourly non-exempt employees who get multiple types of compensation. We'll talk a little bit later about calculating the regular rate of pay for overtime purposes. That can be a little complicated, and it needs to include everything. So if your employees get production bonuses, if they get commissions, all of those things, in addition to an hourly rate, need to be factored in for overtime purposes. So folks who have employees in that type of a pay structure are good targets for these type of cases. And then employees who have been misclassified as exempt. This is one of the first kind of substantive things I'm going to get into is you can't just classify your employees as exempt, pay them a salary, and then think, oh, I don't have to worry about this stuff. I've dealt with clients where they have said to me, well, we don't have any non-exempt employees. Everybody's salaried. And that's an immediate red flag to me, because I'm quite certain in any organization, there needs to be employees who are your hourly non-exempt workers. Everyone is not exempt. These last two are really the scary ones. Employees with workers' compensation claims and terminated employees. I lump those together because employees typically don't go to plaintiffs' lawyers saying, I had this wage and hour violation. My meal periods were late, or I don't think they calculated my overtime properly. Employees get to plaintiffs' lawyers when they bring workers' compensation claims. And I have learned over the years that the workers' comp lawyers have referral relationships with the class action lawyers where they essentially get a kickback. So an employee with even a perfectly legitimate workers' comp claim, they get hurt at work, they get a lawyer, and they're dealing with that issue. And that workers' comp lawyer says, hey, send me all of your pay records. I've got this buddy down the street who might want to look at them and could help you and might be able to get you some more money. And the employee says, okay, fine, whatever. And then those records get sent to this plaintiff's lawyer. The plaintiff's lawyer looks at them and realizes, oh, it looks like they're not, calculating overtime properly. We can bring a class action and we can get you more money. And then now you, the employer, are stuck with dealing with the workers' comp claim plus the class action claim. And then the same is true for terminated employees. When someone is terminated, if they're unhappy about, or if they're laid off, and I'm not just talking about an a performance-based termination. So even laid off employees, if they're unhappy with that decision, they want to blame someone, they go to a plaintiff's lawyer and say, hey, this was some sort of a wrongful termination. And the plaintiff's lawyer will listen to their story. And then we'll also ask, but let's talk about how you were paid. Let me see your time cards. Let me see your payroll records, because they know that if they can bring one of the type of claims we're talking about today, and not just the wrongful termination claim, again, they don't have to do a whole lot of work, and then they can get some significant reward. So it's more bang for their buck, essentially. So those are the type of folks that you need to be thinking about as your possible plaintiffs. And we'll talk about how you can try to manage that and hopefully not deal with one of these claims down the road. Okay, so the first type of claim that I wanted to talk about is this exempt versus non-exempt employee misclassification. So if we go down to the very basic kind of analysis of pay claims, all employees are presumed to be non-exempt, meaning you need to track their hours, you need to pay them overtime. And they're entitled to meal periods and rest breaks, unless you can prove that they fall within one of the 6 categories that we're going to talk about, one of the 6 exemptions. So again, assume everyone is non-exempt, and then you've got to go through some analysis to determine whether you can put them properly into one of the exemptions. Paying a salary isn't enough. I've heard this a number of times over the years that someone says, well, they're exempt, we pay them on a salary basis. That's part of the test, but that's not the only part of the test. So simply paying a salary isn't enough. But note that to be exempt, the standard exempt salary threshold in California is currently $66,560 annually. You calculate that figure by 2 times minimum wage. So minimum wage is currently $16. 2 times the minimum wage times 40 hours a week times 52 weeks. That's 280 work hours in a year. So that's the current threshold to be considered exempt under most of the exemptions. That threshold rises every time the minimum wage goes up. So keep that in mind. Over the last few years, since we've had such significant increases in minimum wage, I've had a number of cases involving clients who just forgot to catch it up, basically. They were just under the threshold. And if you're just under the threshold, then you have an employee who's improperly classified. Another thing that isn't enough is title. So just giving someone a manager title doesn't make them exempt, even if you're paying them the required salary. And the job description isn't enough. So even if you look at the title, you look at the things that they're supposed to be doing, it sounds like it's exempt. But what the real analysis comes down to is looking at their actual duties on an individual basis and how they individually spend their time. And in California, they need to spend more than 50% of their time performing exempt duties. These are, your high level type of duties, exercising discretion and independent judgments. That's one of the buzz terms that you'll hear in these kind of cases, as opposed to performing more routine tasks or following set procedures. So you have to look at the actual duties. They need to be spending more than 50% of their time doing exempt duties. They need to be paid this salary threshold. And then the exemptions that you look at to see which one of these categories do they fall under. There are 6 of them that we deal with primarily. And each of them has a lot more analysis to it. There are more factors than what I have here. We could do a whole hour just talking about these various exemptions. So this is just kind of more of an issue spotting for you. The standard exemptions are the executive exemption. So these are typically your managerial type employees, and they need to supervise 2 or more full-time employees to fall within an executive exemption. The administrative exemption, the best way to think about this exemption is it applies to employees who service your business itself. And the best example that I can give of that is an HR type of department, an HR department or function. So the HR department services your business. They don't service your clients or your customers. They service the business itself. And so, HR type of employees can possibly fall within this administrative exemption. Again, if they're performing exempt duties. An HR coordinator title typically is not exempt. Someone who just processes payroll typically is not exempt. And then there's the professional exemption. This is kind of, what it sounds like. Licensed employees with advanced degrees, doctors, lawyers, engineers, that sort of thing. There's a computer professional exemption. This is super technical. And it applies to kind of higher level systems analysts, not just your day-to-day, IT help desk kind of person. And they have their own pay requirements attached to that. Not the salary. You can do hourly for those, but it's a very detailed analysis for these folks. Outside sales employees, I don't know if this would apply to any of your organizations, but you think of like a traveling salesperson who spends more than 50% of their time away from the work site, trying to make sales. They can be exempt. And then there's an inside sales exemption. So employees who sit at a desk and, you know, try to do sales calls.
I'm at home on a work Zoom. I mean, a training.
Sorry. Hold on, sorry. Can somebody, I don't know who that is. Robin, can you mute them? Sorry, Tiffany.
No problem. So commissioned inside sales employees, if they are paid more than 1.5 times the minimum wage and more than half of their total earnings are in the form of commissions, they can be exempt. This is a limited exemption. It only means they don't have to get paid overtime, but you still have to track their hours, and they're still entitled to meal periods and rest breaks. So those misclassification type of claims are one claim that can form the basis of what we will talk about at the end, the class actions and the PAGA claims. And so if you get it wrong, if you classify someone as exempt and they don't properly fall within an exemption, that employee is entitled to back overtime. So if they were working over 8 hours in a day, you're going to owe that person overtime. And because you were probably paying them at a relatively high salary, when you come to figure out what that hourly rate translates to, it's often pretty high. And so the back overtime payment can be significant. And then those employees will also be entitled to all of the various wage and hour claims that we're going to discuss next. They have the same rights as your regular hourly non-exempt employees and need to get meal periods, rest breaks, those kind of things. So kind of in conclusion on this thought, you should be doing analysis on all employees to decide, okay, is the baseline appropriate? Should we keep them as non-exempt hourly? Or can we properly classify someone as exempt salaried? And I'll tell you that even if you can properly classify someone as an exempt salaried employee, you don't have to. There's no, you don't kind of get it wrong that way. So if they could be exempt and you make a decision, look, we're not going to deal with that, or we're not 100% sure if they can be exempt, so we're going to treat them at hourly, that's perfectly appropriate. And so that should definitely be the fallback. If you're not sure, keep them as an hourly non-exempt employee. Okay, so when we talk about paying overtime, one of the claims that we see is someone says, I should have got overtime, but you didn't pay me overtime. You only paid me straight time hours for all of my hours work. So when is overtime owed? Overtime, which is 1.5 times the regular rate of pay, is owed in California when an employee works over 8 hours in a workday, and it's also owed for the first 8 hours worked on the 7th consecutive day in a work week. And it's owed when an employee works over 40 hours in a work week. So on this last point, think of someone who may work 6 days in a work week. They only work 7 hours each day. So on a daily basis, they're not owed any overtime. But at the end of the week, working 7 hours a day for 6 days, they will have worked 42 hours. So that person is entitled to 2 hours of overtime. On the other hand, if you have someone who works only 1 day in a week, but they happen to work 10 hours in that day, they've worked 2 hours over 8 in a single work day. So that person is also entitled to 2 hours of overtime. That's something that's unique to California. And it often baffles employers in other states. My firm has offices kind of all around the country, and so I'm always talking to my counterparts in other offices, and they can't believe some of the things that we have in California that they don't have in places like Arizona and Texas. Okay, so overtime is 1.5 times the regular rate. And then there are instances when an employee is owed actually 2 times, so double time the regular rate. That kicks in when the employee works over 12 hours in a work day, and it also kicks in when the employee works over 8 hours on the 7th consecutive day in a work week. And this last bullet point here, I want to focus on for a minute. Think about, and I don't know if you all know this answer off the top of your head, in your systems, how do you define work day and work week? It's pretty standard to start a work day at like 12:01 a.m. And oftentimes you see work weeks start either on 12:01 a.m. on a Sunday or 12:01 a.m. on a Monday, but it varies. And you need to know what your system is set up to do. And I had this example come up recently with one of my, I have a son who's 18 years old, and he's got a friend who's got a summer job, and he's in his mind, he's really, working his buns off. And he came to me that, Mrs. Brosnan, I think they're not paying me right. I think I'm on overtime. I said, well, tell me, Jake, what's going on? And he said, I worked 7 days in a row and I didn't get any overtime. And he doesn't know the answer to this. I asked him, I'm like, well, do you know how they define their work week? So in his example, he worked a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then he worked Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So that's 7 days in a row. But he didn't get paid any overtime. He was very aggrieved about this. And I told him that he needs to find out how they count their work week, because it's possible, like most, if they ended their work week on that Sunday, he only worked 4 days in one work week and 3 days in the next. So those are not 7 consecutive days in a single work week. So this can be kind of a tricky analysis, figuring when overtime is due on a daily basis, depending on when you start your workday, and when it's out on a weekly basis, depending on when you start your work week. Another common overtime claim, and this is an example of one of those no good deed goes unpunished, is if you are a generous employer that pays your employees something above just a straight hourly rate, most of the time that additional form of compensation also needs to be factored in when you're figuring out how to pay them overtime. You've got to come up with this regular rate of pay, and it's that regular rate, 1.5 times that regular rate or 2 times that regular rate. That's what needs to be paid when the employee is entitled to overtime or double time. So just the straight hourly rate is not enough. You need to include all forms of compensation. So if employees get production bonuses, that also needs to be included. You don't have to include like holiday or birthday bonus. That's more in the nature of a gift, and truly discretionary bonuses. Figuring out whether a bonus is truly discretionary is one of those things that's very difficult to prove. And if, for example, employees routinely get these bonuses and you say, oh, they're discretionary, we don't have to give it to the employee. There's no guarantee that they're going to get them. But if you see the bonuses, year after year or quarter after quarter, it's very easy for that employee to say, this is not a truly discretionary bonus. I kind of, jokingly tell clients, a truly discretionary bonus is when you wake up one day and just think, gosh, it's a beautiful day. I feel like giving my employees some money. And then you throw them a bonus. That's a truly discretionary bonus. Commissions need to be included. The values of meal and lodging, that doesn't apply to many employers. But the important takeaway here is to consider what all you pay employees, and make a determination whether that is possibly something that needs to be included in the regular rate. And you often have to do this after the fact. So if a commission comes out or a bonus comes out on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, then you need to do some looking backwards and recalculate the overtime that's owed. Okay, so now turning to another type of common wage and hour claim that can form the basis of these class action or POGA claims. Meal and rest break claims. These have just exploded. And I get a report every day of all cases filed in Orange County, all types of cases, not just employment cases. And inevitably, there's at least one case every single day just in Orange County class action where someone's alleging a meal period or rest break case. And again, think about the motivation here. The reason that plaintiffs' lawyers love these is because when there is a violation, an employee is entitled to an extra hour of pay for every time that they don't get a full, timely rest or meal break. And so if on one work day, an employee didn't get both a rest break and a meal break, then they would be entitled to 2 hours of pay for that day. if you do the math, if you think about what you're paying your employees and just kind of run some numbers in your head, you will see how this adds up very quickly. For example, if you have just minimum wage, so $16 an hour employees, and let's say you just have 10 employees, and there's just one violation per employee per week. That's a very low rate. And we'll talk about what's a violation next, but that's a very low rate. So I, did some quick math. So just 10 employees at minimum wage, with one violation per week. You go back a period of 4 years is the exposure period. That's about $34,000 just for a very small employer with minimal violations. So again, you can see why this is attractive to plaintiffs' lawyers. So what are the rules for meal periods and rest breaks? So your rest breaks apply, both of these, of course, apply to just your hourly employees. Your salaried employees, you can, work them. All of us on this call probably, you can work them much harder, but your hourly employees, they must be provided a paid, so on the clock, 10-minute rest break for every 4 hours of work or major fraction thereof. That's the language in the wage order. And it needs to be provided as close to the midway point of that work period as practicable. And even though it's only 10 minutes, employees must be allowed to leave the premises on their rest break. I see a lot of meal and rest break policies where it says that employees can't leave the premises for rest breaks, only for meal periods. And that's a technical violation of the statute. So those are your rest breaks. Your meal periods. For meal periods, again, hourly employees who work more than 4 hours must take an unpaid, so off the clock, 30-minute meal break, and you repeat this pattern for every 5-hour work period. So if you have a work day of over 10 hours, then there needs to be a second 30-minute meal period. The meal break must start no later than 4 hours and 59 minutes into the employee's shift, not at the 5th hour. This is significant, and I hammer on this every time I do a training on this subject because I'm permanently scarred from a class action I handled a while ago for an employer that was like a light industrial type of facility. There was, a big, large work area where everyone had their individual workstations, and they had an actual like bell that rang to start the meal period and a bell that rang to end the meal period. Everyone would get up, leave their workstation, and start their meal. That bell rang at exactly at 5 hours into the shift. And it was a full 30 minutes, and then it rang at the end of the 30 minutes to go back to the workstation. But because it rang 1 minute late, every employee that worked there over a 4-year period was entitled to an extra hour of pay for every single shift they worked. So you can see how significant those numbers can be. And it was, kind of soul crushing for this employer, because it's not like they were a sweatshop where they're denying meal periods or they're, cutting them short, and no one ever said I didn't get one. No one said mine was less than 30 minutes. It was just every single one was 1 minute late every single day, and it was brutal. So during the 30-minute meal period, the employee must be relieved of all duties. They're free to leave the premises, and the period can't be cut short or interrupted. So 29 minutes is a violation. Or if an employee, is taking their meal period and sitting at their desk, and their supervisor walks by and says, "Hey, can you find that one thing for me real quick? I know you're on your meal period, but can you give me that real quick?" That's a violation. This is where training comes into play, and I'm going to mention this later again. Ensure that your employees are taking these breaks and are accurately clocking their time, and ensure that supervisors are not discouraging them from doing so. Or at all interfering with that time. And accurately recording the time is another thing I want to mention quickly, because I know some employers have a practice where the employees just, kind of generally log their time, 8 hours today. They don't have I started at this time and I ended at that specific time. It's just, I worked 8 hours and then 30 minutes get deducted for their 30-minute meal period. That's a violation. Your time, you need to have time records that accurately reflect the actual start time at the beginning of the day, the actual time that the employee starts their meal period, the actual time that they end their meal period, and the actual time that they end their work day. So estimates are violations. When you see time cards that are consistently, just 8 hours exactly every single day, I question those and would encourage you to do the same thing. Okay. So this is ideally, and I know no one works in this environment, but this is an example of what an ideal schedule would look like in a typical 8-hour day. So the employee clocks in at 8, they take their 10-minute rest break. About 2 hours later, so about halfway into the first work period, they clock out for their 30-minute meal break at 12:30. So they've worked 4.5 hours. That's less than 4 hours and 59 minutes. They clock back in 30 minutes later. 2 hours later, they take their rest break, and then they clock out at 4:30, having worked a total of 8 hours. Okay, off the clock time is the next kind of main category of claims that you see forming the basis of these class action and PLAGA times. So what we're talking about when we talk about off the clock time is when an employee works but does not record their time. You cannot turn a blind eye to this. And so what we're talking about is situations when an employee starts working before they clock in. And I've seen cases where, I don't know that this would apply to any of you, but, in a big kind of campus sort of facility, the employee gets there and it takes them minutes to even get to the time clock. But, they're on the premises, they potentially are working, or they have to line up to clock in or go through a security check. These type of preliminary activities can form the basis of an off the clock claim, because the employee might claim, well, that I'm under my employer's control at that time. So I need to pay for that time. Or the employee continue to work after they clock out. This is, more common from what I've seen. So employee clocks out, and as they're on their way out the door, someone stops them. Hey, would you mind, doing this real quick before you leave? And they do whatever it is real quick, but they're technically off the clock, and maybe it only takes them 3 minutes, but that's 3 minutes of unpaid time. Employee doing work when they're clocked out for lunch. I mentioned an example of that already. This next one kind of relates to what I was talking about, the beginning. So spending time at the beginning and the end of this shift, changing in and out of a uniform or safety gear, doing prep or cleanup type of work. All of that is compensable time. Needs to be recorded on a timesheet, and it needs to be paid for. And then this last one is something that, is certainly evolving with technology, that people can look at their phone while they're standing at line in Starbucks before they go to work and think, I'm going to answer a couple quick emails. That's work time. That needs to be compensable time, even if the employee is doing it voluntarily. The fact that you aren't saying, oh, I need an answer to this right now, they're doing that work for your benefit, and it needs to be considered as time worked and paid for. Text messages, I personally work text messages drive me crazy, because people are so casual that for a number of reasons. People just fire them off quickly, and for other types of claims, harassment, discrimination, things like that, people certainly aren't as careful as what they say in text messages. From an evidence preservation standpoint, it's harder to recover text messages than it is emails or anything like that. But it also can lead to off the clock claims, and then reimbursement claims as well. If you are communicating with your employees via text, that means they need to use their phone for work-related purposes. That means you need to pay them for part of that, their phone usage. So an expense reimbursement type of thing. And blaming the employee saying, well, they didn't record their time, they didn't log the time, that's not enough. If they're responding to an email, if they're responding to a text message, or if they are just sending them on their own, you as the employer know that this is happening, and it needs to be paid for. Okay, so those are the main type of underlying claims that we see: the misclassification claims, the overtime claims, meal period and rest break claims, and then off the clock claims. There are the underlying claims that form the basis of these cases, and you can add on to those a number of derivative claims that give the employee additional penalties. What you see on your screen here, and I'm not going to read all of these, is a list of everything that needs to be included on the employee's pay stub. Again, this is one of those things that the plaintiff's lawyers love. If you get it just slightly wrong, that's an automatic violation. It's $100 per employee per pay period. If you just use, for example, just your DBA name and you're not your full entity name, that's one of these technical things that I see. You don't have the inclusive dates of the pay period. All of these, you should be looking at your pay stubs and making sure you're doing all of these. The last few, total hours worked by the employee and all applicable hourly rates in effect during the pay period and the corresponding number of hours worked at each hourly rate. Those come up when an employee says, I worked off the clock and my pay stub only reflects the hours that were on the clock. So therefore, I'm owed for that off the clock time. And now you have a pay stub violation because it doesn't accurately record my time. And similar for the overtime claim. The employee says, I worked, there was overtime that I wasn't paid for. And so that's a violation because it's not accurately reflected on my timesheet. So these get added on to all of the claims, and it just gives the plaintiff's lawyers, kind of more money in their pocket. Another type of derivative claim is late pay at termination. So if at the time of termination, an employee isn't paid every single penny that they are owed, they're entitled to these late penalties up to 30 days of additional pay. So if you, for example, shorted your employee by 15 minutes of off the clock time at the time of termination, is that if that 15 minutes hasn't been paid, they can get another 30 days of pay. So this isn't what they would be paid in a month. This is 30 days of pay. So for a minimum wage employee, $16 an hour times 8 hours times 30 days is almost $4,000. If you shorted them, like I said, even 15 minutes. See, again, you can see why this is a good add-on. Failure to produce records. This is another one that, some of you may have had these before. So an employee requests their personnel file and payroll records, or you get a letter from a lawyer requesting those on behalf of an employee. You're required to produce those. You have 21 days to produce payroll records, 30 days to produce personnel file records. And if you don't, that's a $750 automatic penalty for each, plus attorney's fees. Again, this is why they love these. Okay, and so now getting to PAGA. What we are talking about, and I joke and say PAGA is, a 4-letter word. It stands for the Private Attorneys General Act. And it essentially is a class action without the hurdles of a class action. To have a class action, plaintiffs' lawyers have to jump through a number of hoops. They have to file kind of complicated motions. It's more work for them. A PAGA claim, you can bring a claim on behalf of a group of employees, but you don't have to jump through all of those hurdles. So sometimes we see plaintiffs' lawyers bring those on any one of those or all of those underlying wage claims we just talked about, plus a PAGA claim. So therefore bringing them on behalf of a group of employees. Sometimes we see them going for all 4. So the underlying claims, the PAGA claim, and a class action. So they could represent groups of employees under either a class action or a PAGA claim or both. And PAGA adds additional penalties for a variety of the labor code wage and hour claims. We talked about the most popular ones already, but there's a bunch of other claims that also can form the basis of a PAGA claim. I just went through the most common ones. The additional penalties can be $100 to $200 per employee per pay period. 75% of the recovery used to go to the state labor and workforce development agency and 25% to the aggrieved employees. So this is why the state loves it. It's significant revenue for the state and they don't have to do any work to get it. And finally, you know, the kicker that we've been talking about, it awards plaintiffs' lawyers their attorney's fees as well. There has been some there have been some developments, like literally right now, regarding PAGA. There was a fantastic ballot initiative that I was hoping to see on the ballot in November that was drafted by employers groups to reform PAGA. Think about what we went through a few years ago with the big fight over independent contractors and Uber and Lyft and all of that stuff. And it actually got to the ballot. Something similar was going to happen with PAGA, and the best part of it was that it took away attorney's fees. So it still gave the employees, basically the same rights, but it took away the ability to get attorney's fees, which have just gutted the plaintiffs' lawyers and significantly reduced these claims. So I was so excited about this, and was telling everybody I know, make sure you vote for this when you see it on the ballot in November. But there was a recent shift. Basically, our legislature was able to work a deal, and the governor approved it with the business groups supporting that initiative to do their own PAGA reform. So it didn't get to the voters. And so under this new reformed PAGA, which only applies to PAGA claims made after June 19, 2024, there are some slight differences. So again, the employee can still sue on their own behalf and on behalf of other employees. They can only, the employee must have suffered the violation within the last year. Previously, they could go back even farther than that. Employers now have the ability to remediate or cure some of these claims and get the penalties reduced. The $100 or $200 per pay period can be reduced if the employer takes some remedial measures or actually cures the potential violation. And you have opportunities to do that now when you get a PAGA notice. So before an employee files a PAGA claim, they have to give notice to the Labor and Workforce Development Agency and to the employer. So you get a letter first before you see one of these claims actually filed in court. So that you have some ability to basically reduce your exposure. And because what I mentioned earlier, that it's a per pay period penalty, employers who paid employees on a weekly basis were punished basically because they had more pay periods than employers who pay biweekly. So now under the new PAGA, employers with the weekly paydays are not punished. They get a 50% reduction. And then you can't, we call it stacking of penalties. So when we talk about meal and rest breaks and off the clock and overtime, plaintiffs' lawyers would argue those are 3 different penalties, PAGA penalties right there. So I should get the $100 per pay period 3 times. So $300 per pay period for those 3 different violations. That is now clearly not an ability that they have. The employees now get a higher recovery. They get 35% of the recovery, and the LWDA gets 65%. And then here's the big bummer in my mind. It's under the New Deal, and I'm cynical after having done this for 28 years and think this is exactly, what was driving the bus to make this reform happen, because they were afraid that this was going to get taken away by the voters. Plaintiffs' lawyers still get their fees. So these claims are not going away. Maybe you're not going to owe as much, but they're not going away, unfortunately. So these are all the new rules that apply for claims after June 19, 2024, June 19th of this year. All right. So let's talk about some possible action items. I kind of weaved some of this in as we were going, but I want to focus on these again and raise some new ones. So what can you do? How can you avoid these kind of claims? One, don't turn a blind eye to an employee working off the clock. I think we spent pretty significant time talking about this. Don't allow supervisors to contact employees outside of normal working hours, including by text message or any other method, unless you're going to pay for that time and unless you're going to provide employees some reimbursement for the use of their cell phone. Take a look at your written policies. Make sure you have good policies regarding meal periods, rest breaks, accurate timekeeping, and then off the clock time. As I mentioned earlier, a rest break policy that says something about an employee not being allowed to leave the premises, that's a technical violation. A fantastic resource, if you haven't discovered this, for good employment policies and forms and handbooks. And I'll show this when I get off the PowerPoint, a great desktop resource is published by the California Chamber of Commerce. They have the kind of desktop resource, as I call it, is called the Labor Law Digest. I have one here. I get really geekily excited when they get new ones every year. They come out at the beginning of the year, and when you buy that, you get access to the Cal Chamber forms. So they're fantastic, and I would encourage any of you to visit their site and buy the Labor Law Digest. If you want to draft a handbook inexpensively, it's a few $100 to use their handbook software, and it's really good. Do trainings. All the things that I've shared with you today are things that you should share with your supervisors. And make sure that everyone knows what they can and can't do. Send out reminders. I love when I have these type of cases for meal periods and rest breaks specifically, the employee likes to say, well, they discouraged me from taking my meal period. I wasn't allowed to take my meal period. That's why it was short, or that's why I started it late. If you as the employer can prove that, no, it was the employee who actually chose for whatever reason to take the meal period late, or they chose to take a short meal period, it's difficult to prove. But if you can prove that, you can defeat that claim. And one kind of, arrow in your quiver is to send out reminders. Here's our good policy. You need to take your meal period. It needs to be taken before the 5th hour work. It needs to be 30 full minutes. You're not to do any work. If you can show you're consistently reminding employees of that policy, it makes it harder for them to show that you're the one forcing the violation. And in that same vein, consider, we call them attestations, daily or weekly attestations in the timekeeping system. A lot of payroll companies has come around to offering this as part of their service, where in the timekeeping system, the employee actually has to, check a box saying, these are my hours worked today, these are accurate, and yes, I got my meal period, and yes, I got my rest break. And nobody interfered with that, or something along those lines. Or at the end of the week, there's some sort of an attestation like that. Don't round time. It's gotten harder and harder to do this effectively and in a way that doesn't violate the California wage and hour laws. So timekeeping systems that round time, you have to prove that it's never in the employer's favor and that it always balances out or is in the employee's favor if you do rounding, and that can be really hard to prove. So best practice is pay to the minute if you can. That's certainly what we recommend that clients do. Audit the time records. So periodically look at employees' time cards. Look for those meal periods that start after 4 hours and 50 minutes for the short meal periods. Consider paying that 1 hour penalty. If you see those violations, pay it on the front end, so they're not claiming it on the back end. And you can discipline employees. Hey, you're violating our policies. You need to take your meal periods earlier. You're not allowed to take them later. You can do that as the employer. Or you can discipline supervisors if you find out that they're the ones that are encouraging that practice. I mentioned earlier time entries that are just like too consistent, that are always exactly the same. I mean, we're not robots. We don't start work and end work at the exact same time, or start our meal period and end our meal period at the exact same time, typically. So those make me nervous when I see them. And then investigate immediately when you get a complaint about a possible wage and hour violation, whether it's informal or as part of an official notice, because again, you have an opportunity to cure some of these. And if you can do that, you can reduce your exposure. And then finally, when you're exiting someone, as I mentioned at the beginning, those are the people that will get themselves in front of a plaintiff's lawyer and say that they're ticked off about their termination. And the plaintiff's lawyer is going to say, well, let's talk about your, time cards. So consider paying some form of severance and getting a release from that employee. That's really the only insurance policy that you're going to get, is that type of an agreement on the front end that they can't sue you. And I will caution you that amounts that are indisputably owed. So if you know you owe your employee a certain amount of money, you can't pay them that exact amount and say, oh, now sign this release. That release is ineffective. It has to be some sort of consideration above and beyond what they're actually owed for that release to be effective. But it can be, again, it can be the best insurance you can get for these type of claims. Okay, that was my last slide. We have a few minutes. I haven't had a chance to look in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing here. I just kind of vomited out a ton of information. I don't know if any questions came in, Robin, or if you want to ask any questions now, but I'm happy to spend a few minutes.
Thank you, Tiffany. This was, I took a bunch of notes. I saw everybody's head down. So no chats, nothing in the chat box, but if there's anybody, maybe you want to raise your hand, or I know we're going to send the deck out. We will send this recording out. So I encourage you to share it with your team. I personally texted a couple people that I know couldn't be here, and I told them that we would get that to them.
I'm showing my screen with my little California Labor Law Digest book. It's like on my desk all the time. This is from Cal Chamber. Highly recommend you get it. It's a couple $100 and it's a fantastic resource.
Well worth it. So if any of you need that link to that particular chamber book, I know Tiffany, maybe you can, they can just Google the chamber. I imagine it's pretty easy.
Yeah, it's California Chamber of Commerce, and they have a store on their website. And that specific book is called the Labor Law Digest. And once you buy that book, you get a code to access their forms.
Okay. I wrote down that attestation. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing. I've never heard of that, but it makes so much sense. Is there anything that you can add to that about like how to help our people on the call, like to make sure that they have those in place? Or you said maybe some of the payroll software has it. Like, what do you suggest?
Yeah, it can be as kind of analog or digital as you want, depending on how you do your timekeeping. So some people do paper time sheets still, and you can have a form that part of your paper timesheet includes, a box at the bottom and, some space for the employer if they want to write, where they say, yeah, I've gotten all my meal periods or rest breaks, or if any of my meal periods appear late or short, this is the reason, and they could fill that out. Or again, if a lot of payroll companies offer that service, that they're doing, the timekeeping that's linked to payroll or timekeeping, and it's pretty common now. It used to be, kind of a manual adjustment, but as far as I'm aware, a lot of payroll companies have that kind of automatic, or timekeeping systems have that available as part of the process.
We have one question from Tracy who said, do you discourage classifying someone as salary non-exempt?
I wouldn't say I discourage it, but if you have someone who you're not quite sure of, then I would discourage it. Because if you're not sure, you were much better off classifying them as non-exempt, paying them an hourly rate, doing all of the things we talked about. That being said, I understand completely why it's easier from an administrative perspective to treat someone as exempt. And there are lots of positions that are properly classified as an exempt position, and you can pay them a salary. I know a lot of times people prefer themselves to be considered salaried and exempt as the employee. individually as well. So there are lots of good reasons to classify someone as exempt as long as you can do it properly. And if you have any question in your mind as to whether or not it's proper, then don't do it.
Tiffany, I will share your contact info if anybody needs to reach out to you, Engage services or whatever. I'll make sure that we get that information to all of you, but it's been
Yeah,
an
happy
hour,
to. And
and
to
I-
that point, Robin, real quick, sorry. We have, our firm sends out periodic legal alerts and newsletters and things like that. And if you want to pass along, if anyone wants to contact me and say, add me to your list, I'm happy to do that. We do seminars like this periodically for clients and prospective clients, and I'm happy to invite anyone to those as well.
Excellent. Well, it's been an hour, so thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I just know what a value it is to our network and the whole greater Orange County nonprofit community. So thank you for your time. Thank you to all of
Happy
you
to
for
do it.
joining today. Have a wonderful day. And we really appreciate you, Tiffany. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Bye.